Welcome to Par Lettres, a long-form podcast hosted by Nishi Pandit and Andrew Flores, where we explore the work of Jacques Lacan through free associative conversation. Par Lettres exists as an invocation and enactment of analytic discourse, where we speak from the locus of our own desire and engagement with Lacan's oeuvre. We invite you to hear Lacan through the conversation of speaking beings, whether you are philosopher, student, clinician, or simply curious about what psychoanalysis has to offer to the cipher of our mortal destiny.
All right, what is going on, everybody? We are back with another episode. This is the Par Lettres channel, but interesting fact, this is not just the Par Lettres channel. This is a collab with the Vanishing Mediators, with our special guest and good friend, Nick Castellucci, aka Free Beer Tomorrow, which makes up the other half of our infamous channel, the Vanishing Mediators, where we go over themes in Lacanian psychoanalysis and emancipatory theory, such as Frederick Jameson, Althusser, Marx, etc. And this has been an episode in the making because we've tried to collab for quite some time now. And out in the woodworks offline, we're also doing our cartel on Seminar 4. So stay tuned for some really fascinating conversations around that. But this is going to be an interesting conversation because we're going to talk about a very difficult essay in the early Lacan. I think this essay was published or submitted in 1945. It is The Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty. And what's great is that there are three of us. And as Lacan drops a very niche Latin saying, tres faciunt collegium, three's company, or a company is always made of three parties. So this is very exciting, specifically because this essay deals with three subjects and what is called the prisoner's dilemma. So yeah, I mean, before we take it away, and you guys have anything to add to that?
No, I'm just glad to have Nick here with us. I think this will be a really interesting exploration. I think, as you said, Andrew, this is early Lacan. I think it's also classic Lacan. This is before like the mirror stage essay even, but there's aspects of that already in a premonitory form here. And I think this really strikes me as kind of a surrealistic riddle and of kind of a presentation of Lacan as the logician, which I think is a thread throughout his teaching, and maybe it develops even more with, the mathematic formalization. But I think here we really encounter like logic, and I think Lacan is just the perfect person to show us what that means.
Yeah, and it's funny because speaking of logic and mathematics and formalization, as you know, like if there's a seminar that's truly dear to me or foundational to my work, it's probably Seminar 16. And he has this like lesson like on like or towards a logician's practice and how like we should situate ourselves like in the practice of logic. But he also says like prior to that lesson in the beginning, there is no meta language, right? And that applies to logic. Like logic doesn't come before language. Like logic is just like a formalization of like an already pre-existing field of language. And he says, just as there is no physics that stretches over nature like God's good grace, there is no logic that could encompass all of language, right? And so this is where like we get this idea of incompleteness, which he gets from Gödel, the logician and mathematician, but also this is like his buildup of like there is no meta language, there is no sexual relation, et cetera, et cetera. But we're getting this like early
Yeah.
prerequisite like of like Lacan talking about the logic as like a game, right?
Yeah.
With the facets of language and these interruptions, etc. And what I also find interesting is that, like you said, Nishi, like this is before the mirror stage. I think this is also around the time like where he published the family complexes,
Right.
which we went over in our cartel, which is a fascinating work.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you bring up language and its relation to speech, because I was going through his rendition of the prisoner's dilemma from the what is speech, what is language lecture in seminar 2, and he gets into a debate with, I think he's a theologian, scholar of Greek, about, or I think he might also be referencing something in Hebrew and its translation, but he wants to stress that the affirmation that any of the prisoners, but let's say prisoner A, makes near the end, in the moment of the conclusion that I am white, is a speech act. He doesn't emphasize this dimension of it as much in the Acree essay, but it's really helpful to read the passage in Seminar 2 about this, because he directly relates it to speech and language.
And that would make sense too, right? Because we have, right after this essay in the Acree, is the presentation on transference, and then it's followed directly by the function and field of speech and language, right?
Yeah.
And so that makes sense. Already seminar 1 is at the same time as function and field. So by seminar 2, this is already a paradigm. So that makes sense to me too, that you point that out, Nick. I think that's an important observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of funny. I'm gonna make a little like witty remark. Like, there's Wittgenstein that says like everything's like a language game, and like philosophy is, just another rendition of a language game. But I think like, well, language is like already presupposed to this combinatory factor that Lacan stresses ad nauseum throughout his career. But I think like what we get that's distinct from like the combinatory factor, which is like got a lot of contingency to it, is the speech games. There's something about speech that creates a lot of like misunderstandings, misrecognitions, misencounters, that beg the question of certain things, that provoke the other, right? Because it's not just a language game; it's a speech game that evokes the what he'll call, I think not in here, but when he references logical time and subversion of the subject, the pure subject, which is just the other of game theory. And I like to kind of like dumb it down as like whenever you play like I don't know, like Street Fighter, and you're playing like by yourself, you're playing against the computer. The pure subject of game theory would be the computer that knows all the rules and combinations, and the can formalize it into a different outcome, right? That is like the, to me, not just the other of language, but the other of speech that can provoke things like feints and fides, like promises that aren't articulated in the statement itself, but in the way that it's performed, right? You are my woman, I am your husband, or you are my slave, I am your master, etc. And I've said this before, Nick knows this already. Like the feint would be like deceptive speech, like Freud's joke. You're telling me you're going to Krakow when you want me to think you're going to Littenberg, but I know you're going to Krakow, so why are you lying to me, right? And I think like that's like to end it right there. That's like what we see formulated in this dilemma, maybe not explicitly, but the function of speech articulated into a logical reason.
Yeah, and I think he is seizing upon a very essential component, the motor of time itself, as something that philosophy, at least Western philosophy with its strict penchant for categorization, cannot isolate. It can't isolate the temporality that he says consists in precipitation, in haste. And I think that's so fascinating. And I think it's also fascinating that part of the game that they're made to play is the justification for the choice that they ultimately make. They have to explain that. And the explanation, and he offers like 2 versions of the explanation that they could give. But either way, it's kind of like, and there's a very major distinction between these 2 explanations. And we can look at that later. But I think what's interesting is that it's a sophism because the explanation itself is going to repress the moments. The two scansions are either going to be combined into one, or maybe pretty much like ignored entirely, because when you present something in terms of its pure logic, time falls out.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you brought up like the history of Western philosophy, because I think with what makes Lacan great is that he goes back and he reads the philosophers in antiquity and even medieval time, and not just medieval scholastics like Aquinas, but even those mystics and those prefigures of the Renaissance period that kind of get forgotten in the mainstream thread of Western philosophy. Um, we tend to think in contemporary philosophy, there's I think overly saturated use of ontology, right? Which ontology is just one branch of metaphysics. But in order to do philosophy, right, you have to understand logic. Logic was the foundation for doing philosophy in its, you could say, exoteric form. And he will use Aristotle as like the father of like formalized logic, right? And the syllogism, which is like the most like iconic syllogistic phrase, but is like the foundation of logic, is, you know, um, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is something that like Lacan will constantly grapple with, as simple as it is and intuitive as it might be. Formal logic runs into a lot of problems when taken to its like conclusion. And I like this line. Hopefully, we're not going too fast because there's so much to break down in this essay. But again, with judgment and anticipation, I think it's important. This passage reminded me from what you were saying is like well, and this is on page two, pagination 209, 171. While doubt has since Descartes' time been integrated into the value of judgment, it should certainly be noted that for the form of assertion studied here, the latter's value depends less upon the doubt which suspends the assertion than on the anticipated certainty which first introduced it. And I think that's important because doubt as a form of judgment is important, because this is where we get not only like the subject of science, but also a form of judgment in philosophy that we could trace back to the Pyrrhonian skeptics, or even like Sextus Empiricus, right? And that doubt wasn't just to like, oh, like, I don't believe in anything at all, like, just to be like what we kind of today call a cynic, right? One who doesn't want to be deceived by anything and is kind of like cynical of all things, but rather to suspend judgment as much as possible to develop a sense of tranquility, because it was a sort of ethical thing. And Descartes takes that on not to provide Greco-Roman form of like hedonism of tranquility, but to kind of prove God and also to prove a field of knowledge. But right here, I find this interesting because in this logical game, it's really this, as he says, this anticipated certainty, which presupposes any form of judgment or introduces any form of logical reasoning in this puzzle, right? It's this haste for certainty, or this expectation that certainty is about to come. You start with certainty or expect certainty to arise before you even have a judgment to exist.
Right, and I think this goes back to what Nick brought up as well about the temporal thread of this entire essay, or Lacan's point that logic is something that is a temporal process, right? I think this is a very original assertion, actually, because he's going to go back to this whole idea of the spatial and the temporal in the mirror stage essay to point out that the subject is a spatio-temporal complex, right? The mirror stage is the spatial lure of our own image, but through that spatial lure, the subject historicizes himself, projects himself into history, right? So there's that temporal line also. And I think this essay is where we really begin to understand what that means, this idea of historicization, or the fact that there's a subjective logic that's inherent in time, and the fact that time is a process, that it has lag, that it has anticipation, that it even brings forth speech as something that could declare certainty, um, and there are all of these movements inside of that, like you were pointing out, like the suspension, the anticipation, right? Again, the jubilance of the infant in front of the mirror is an anticipatory jubilance, right? It's a functional anticipation. They don't yet have motor coordination in which to realize that which they anticipate. And this is in some sense the very nature of the subjective dilemma for Lacan. And I think that's why he gets into the prisoner situation as well. And he says somewhere in here that maybe that context isn't so, incidental to his message either. It's like maybe we're bound by these kinds of experiential dilemmas, in fact. And it's like he says in the same page that you were just reading, Andrew. I underlined this passage on the top. What makes this act so remarkable in the subjective assertion demonstrated by the sophism is that it anticipates its own certainty owing to the temporal tension with which it is subjectively charged, and that based on this very anticipation, its certainty is verified in a logical precipitation that is determined by the discharge of this tension.
No, that was good. What page was that again?
171.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So it's still
that's
on this.
funny.
Yeah, it's still on
It's still on
the
that
same
page.
page.
I highlighted
Yeah.
the exact same thing. Yeah.
No, yeah, this is, yeah. I mean, again, we could go on and on and on about like the framework of this essay, but I think we would get lost in a moment of understanding and never concluding. But maybe, I mean, I don't know if anybody else has anything to say before we get into the text, but I will say one thing that I forgot to add in my spiel was with this investigation or deconstruction of formal logic, he kind of reduces it to these elements that we see in, I've said this before too in many conversations with you guys, but we see this in like legal terms. But it's he says in here like this protasis and apodosis, right, which is just like a conditional clause, and from that conditional clause you could have a concluding statement to it. And what's interesting is that when he does this, like on the background of formal logic, what he's pretty much saying is that you could have like a very um, fallacious argument and still reach a conclusion, right? Um, that like, yeah, the clause may not make sense, but it still produces like a sort of, as you're saying, like a tension or a subjective temporal moment with a conclusion, right? But it doesn't mean that the conclusion is necessarily correct, that it circles back on itself, right? To formulate again the clause, and he'll use the term sophism, right? It's sophistical because of its line of reasoning itself.
Right, which kind of, it forces any one of the prisoners to ultimately present the argument in a subjectified or desubjectified form. That's the two different explanations for the conclusions that are reached. One could either say, like he says here, I hasten to conclude that I was white because otherwise they would have preceded me in reciprocally recognizing themselves to be whites. Or one must know that one is white when the others have hesitated twice in leaving. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's like the I function that ultimately undergirds the conclusion is something that could have only emerged in the process of reasoning on the basis of the haste and the act, right? Which is a judgment. But the judgment is not something that can be worked out through mere speculation, because there isn't really time to speculate, because it's like, their freedom is at stake.
Yeah, and also that like it doesn't. Of course, you need to have some form of deduction, and we'll get into that in reading out the problem. But he says that everything is founded on verification, right? Verification is the most important thing, which requires uh, things to be verified and acknowledged within the field of vision, right? So it's not something that you can do outside of the game, but only through logically running the game out, right?
Right, that's what I mean. So it's like there is no abstract formulation that one is sort of like drawing up in the chalkboard of their mind's eye. It really is the interhuman, intersubjective moment of the glance initially that would propel you forward or arrest you in that moment. Because when you think about it, it's anxiety provoking, right? He talks about this anxiety that's involved in the precipitation of this temporal moment, and you can imagine that IRL, the anxiety would be overwhelming to the point where you might not be able to actually have this like detached, calm, impassive vantage point from which you could just analyze the situation. All you have to go off of is what the other two are doing. After the fact, you might be, to kind of like prop yourself up, you could say, oh, well, this is what I thought. This is how I drew this conclusion because I'm so smart, but that's not how it works, really.
Right, it's different
It
from
is
après coup, right? It's like it's not an afterwardness that gives us the logical comprehension. It's a logic that unfolds in the very moment in which we need to arrive at an understanding. And as you're pointing out, Lacan makes it clear that although there's like a visual element to, if we could just see, if everybody could just see, if you could see the disc that you had, it would all be solved, but you don't, but everybody else sees your disc. And so all you're left with is the fact that you can't spatially arrive at a conclusion. You can only temporally arrive at a conclusion derived from your observation of other people's own process of deduction and the action that it leads them to. And so this is very fascinating, because now we're caught in the anxiety that I think is in fact um, inherent in time. I think Lacan's trying to point out that time is a source of subjective anxiety, that it is itself a scansion of sorts. You know. Um,
Yeah, and it's almost as if, in one way, Lacan is being somewhat Kantian here because time is a form of intuition for Kant. It's like an ultimately unsurpassable horizon of all experience. But of course, for Kant, that has more to do with a kind of static model of the analytic, of cognition, and the human being. Lacan takes it further in showing that the precipitation of subjectivity itself and taking hold of that, appropriating that position, can only be achieved through the intervention of mirroring reciprocity between little others.
mhm. Mhm. Yeah, there's even like a fragment here of the fact that the unconscious is the other's discourse. There's maybe a very early conception of the function of the gaze, you know? I think there's a lot in here actually
It's all
that
here, yeah.
really pulls out later in Lacan.
And even sexuation, I would say, near the end, if that isn't too much of a leap. But how does a man, through his version of the syllogism, arrive at the conclusion that, as you were saying before, Andrew, he is in fact one of many in a universalized totality. But ultimately, it's the anxiety of, well, if I don't declare myself as such,
Mm.
others might convince me I'm not, and the clock's ticking.
Well, it's also funny too, because then it also like adds in a lot more flavor to it with Kantian ethics itself, because like when Kant talks about like not just the categorical imperative, but like I think it was a clip that I saw on Instagram of Zizek talking about Kant where like this was like younger Zizek, and he's saying like what makes Kant so radical, and you could see like Lacan take this on with like the ethics of psychoanalysis and desire, is that you are the one who authorizes oneself with moral responsibility, right? And that's what makes it more radical, but also anxiety provoking because of bearing real responsibility, but also bearing the one who self-authorizes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Kant is talking about, we can even go beyond just like, metaphysics, morals, particular practical reason, but like in his essay, like what is enlightenment? It's like, awakening man from his like immaturity. What does that entail? And if that entails this ability to self-authorize, like what does that mean? Right. Um, which, like, to the average person be like, "Oh, so, like, a serial killer could be like, I'm gonna, like, authorize myself as killing people, and that's ethical." It's like, no, that's not at all what that means. In fact, the serial killer would not be self-authorizing. The serial killer would be not following the categorical imperative, or even in a Lacanian sense, following their desire. They're
Mm.
misrecognizing the desire in the
Mm-hmm.
other, in
Mm-hmm.
a very sadistic or, fetishistic way. Um, but in the same sense, analogous with uh, Lacanian psychoanalysis, the self-authorizing of the analyst, but also the self-authorizing of this was an analysis itself. And I conclude that analysis has conducted itself and, I've been cured, right? That takes a lot of responsibility. And there is the threat of anxiety that comes with that.
Right. It's like the question that brings up for me is what is and where is the source of verification then? I think this is a thread in Lacan's teaching too. And maybe it's all tied into institutionalism and his move to bring psychoanalysis into a dimension that's profoundly ethical, in fact. And this whole self-authorization is profoundly ethical in that. And it's actually logical too. I think there's a thread here where tying between logic and ethics that's very important. Um, and the fact that there's anxiety in that, because even the certainty of the prisoner, he seems certain, I can only be a white, right? But that certainty is already subject to doubt, right? And so he's caught. He's caught in the dilemma of that, of his own certainty, in fact, as something that can be doubted. So how can he authorize his freedom in that situation, right?
Yeah, that's really good. And we experience this in analysis where what might be perceived as doubt on the part of the analyst, what one experiences as a patient in not really gaining any purchase for their imaginary projections, divulgences in response to the analyst's questioning or silence becomes an occasion for doubt. And everything is held up to this doubt, even if the analyst is neither confirming or affirming what the analysand has to say, let in a countertransferential way that they shouldn't be revealing. It doesn't matter because there is really ultimately no ground for um, ever affirming the truth of a statement that one makes about oneself. And it's only through the authorization of, like you were saying, Anishi, a kind of institutional logic that is ultimately based on a kind of like exclusionary policy that we can ever have a semblance of certainty. But throughout our entire lives, from before we're born, when a birth certificate is issued for us, there is an institution which steps in to authorize ourselves as, theoretically free, but only insofar as the institution deems you, you know, the liberty to be a citizen, an individual endowed with rights.
I mean, it's also like even exemplary of like the institution of psychoanalysis that he's critiquing. And when he's talking about ego psychology, like the only healthy ego is like the analyst ego that's held as standard, right? But this isn't like the analysts self-authorizing themselves, because that takes like a radical leap of freedom, versus like the ego, which already has its forms of identifications and attachments to the institution itself. So really the analyst isn't self-authorizing, but using their ego as a misrecognized form of what is standard and healthy based upon the guidelines of the IPA, right? Or the dominant analytic institution of that time, and even till now.
Yeah. And there's
Mhm.
something that just occurred to me, just to take it back to temporality real quick, and Kant, is that Kant's major contribution here is Copernican, of course. And ultimately it's like he's attempting to resolve the problematic introduced by Descartes. But I think in just defining time as a form of intuition, that he still is in one way like outsourcing the problem in a way that Lacan is addressing here, where it's like, and Malaire talks about this in the essay that I shared with you guys about the session. He says how philosophy is always grappling with this question of whether time as a category includes itself, and how can time, in terms of like a kind of Russell's set, also include itself as one of its elements. So what would time be outside of the experience of subjective time? What would time be outside of the incremental time that we measure through clock time? um it would have to be something, in a sense, other than itself. This is how I interpret it. And then it ceases to be time. But in the time of that comes about through the speech act in analysis is of a different quality entirely, you know?
Right. Yeah, and I it's been a while since I read Critique of Pure Reason, but like you have, he says all knowledge at first starts from experience, but it doesn't only pertain to experience itself, like in the form of like what the empiricist would, um, confine knowledge to, like sensible experience, raw data. Um, but he says like you have the faculty of like sensibility, right? When like cognition is stimulated by the experience or the phenomena, and then from sensibility we get intuitions, and that intuitions is where like most of our kind of concepts are formulated, whether like a priori or not. And he's talking about like simple mathematics, or like definitive judgment, like was it a bachelor is an unmarried man, right? These sort of analytical statements. But then you have the faculty of understanding, which is something quite distinct from the intuition and sensibility. But I bring this up because like when you mention time and like can time contain itself, it's also interesting for Kant to say that like, well, space and time, are part of like, our modes of experience. I forget which one is like purely a priori and the other one, whatever jargon. But let's take, for instance, the Newtonian notion of time as objective. But that's just but if I understand in the Kantian sense, like a form of intuition by the faculty of time itself, right? It's not like an exact replica of like time, dare I say time as it is, but only just a sort of intuitive model of what time would be like, right? And in the Newtonian sense, it's just like this simple billiard ball cause and effect, right? Which I think is similar but quite different than the Aristotelian notion of time, which I think just has to do with just motion, right? Um,
Yeah.
but for
Yeah.
for the Newtonian physics, it's an objective model, but an objective model that can only be understood through the faculties of Kant, right? Of space time intuition, right? So we have something that's already sensible and intuitive upon the contact of phenomena, and then we create a sort of intuitive model of it, but it's not directly time itself.
Right. And that's, I think, what Kant is attempting to stress here with these special forms of intuition. And you have the forms of understanding, which have to do with the extension in space, primary and secondary qualities that belong to different objects. Those can be easily like tabulated and inventoried. But his solution to, at least when it comes to the question of what is space, he wants to find a kind of like synthesis between the Leibnizian Wolffian understanding of space. If I'm getting this correctly, because it's been a while since I've read Kant, but between figures, objects in space, the distance between those figures is what's definitive of space, and then the Newtonian idea of space as a vacuum. And the same questions ultimately redound upon temporality and time. But to take it back to this essay, what Kant is already presupposing, I think, is like a constitution of the I function. And he can't really explain the constitution of the I function as anything but an a priori, because these forms of intuition are a priori. Lacan wants the symbolic to be something like an a priori, but ultimately not a priori, because that would just mean that, well, it's always been here. And that becomes a question of origins and ends. And he says in Seminar 2, I'm not interested in origins, because origins always imply a goal. There's always like a teleology to it. He wants to explain how there is no emergence of the symbolic but via imaginary reciprocity.
Right, and I'm flashing on something adjacent, which from what Andrew was saying and what you were saying, which is like when we think about astrology or astronomy as a way of it's a way of creating time, to verify movements that are observed, right? Like we can observe the orbits of planetary movements. We can observe like day and night and say this is clock time, 24 hours, etc. But these are just ways of conceptualizing or verifying to ourselves movements that are occurring. It doesn't actually suppose time, as such. It is already kind of an imaginary overlay on the fact of movements, and there's different ways of conceiving of that. So I don't know. I think that's interesting also from the angle that Lacan mentions this word eclipse in the text, which caught my eye. Because he says here, its evidence is revealed in a subjective penumbra as the growing illumination of a fringe at the edge of the eclipse that the objectivity of the time for comprehending undergoes due to reflection. This is 168 to 169. And, earlier on 168, he mentions intuition as well, which you guys were riffing on in relation to Kant. So anyway, I just think that's interesting. Like eclipse means to fail to appear, right? The Greek root means to fail to appear. And so it's like this lack of verification in a way. If something's eclipsed, it can't be verified. It can't really be seen, There is no instant of the glance at something that is eclipsed, right? It's kind of, it's withheld from your glance. It's withheld from your comprehension, So I just think that was an intentional usage on his part that somehow in my associative unconscious, all these threads came out just now.
Yeah. It's the disc. It's the color of the disc, which is eclipsed.
Exactly.
Well, maybe this is the time we could actually get into the problem itself.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not going to read like how the first sentence or the first paragraph of like the buildup goes, but just explain it right here and then read I think the important part, which is the sophism. So Lacan lays this out by saying that like a prison warden enters this unit where there are 3 prisoners, and he says, like, for reasons I may not make known to you, gentlemen, I will make one of you free, or I must free one of you. And there's this game where, as we've been saying, there are 5 discs, 3 white and 2 black, and I've chosen the combination to put on you guys, and it's out of your visual field, um, and so pretty much you're left at your leisure to deduce on your own without speaking to one another which disc you are, right? And you must be able to give a good uh, logical argument to be on why you're the specific disc and what makes you the free subject, right? Um, and so, and he says right here, his conclusion must be found upon logical and not simply probabilistic grounds, right? I think that is important. And then so he says right here that after agreeing to the situation, the subjects are adorned with white discs, no use being made of the black ones. So the black discs are removed from the game entirely and are absent. But in their minds, right, the 2 black discs are present. So there's already an error in the game based upon not only the disc being taken out, but the anticipation that they're in there, right? So there's already a certainty right there. Now, what I'll read right here is this is important because this is where we are talking about this perfect solution, which is also a sophism, right? He says right here, and this is the quote of the prisoner, right? Once the game starts, I am a white, and here is how I know it. Since my companions were white, I thought that had I been a black, each of them would have been able to infer the following. If I too were a black, the other would have necessarily realized straight away that he was a white and would have left immediately. Therefore, I am not a black, and both would have left together convinced they were white. As they did nothing of the kind, I must be a white like them. At that, I made for the door to make my conclusion. And so all 3 of them leave simultaneously, right?
Right. So maybe do you want to break down that logic further, Andrew, to like for somebody who hears that and might think like to me the internal logic is a harder one to grasp. The one of if I too were a black, the other would have necessarily realized straight away he was a white and would have left immediately. I think this is the crux of the whole logic.
Yes. And so this is what makes it a sophism, because it's a perfect solution based upon a certainty and also like a false, like it's specious and fallacious pretty much. Like
Right.
it only makes sense out of like this anticipated certainty. But then once we find out in the field of verification that it's only verifiable based upon the look of the other, or that these others are present in their suspended movements, and not even just one suspended movement, but that they then hesitate and suspend their motion a second time, which we'll get into. Um, but pretty much he says right here, I'll read it, like I won't read the whole thing, but like I'll point out like the clues. He says first, I am a white, and here's how I know it, right? Because he thought that he had might been a black disc because he's seen the other 2 people were wearing white. And if I too were a black, the others would have necessarily realized uh, that they were white and would have left immediately. But therefore, I am not a black disc, and both would have left together convinced that they were white, right? As they did nothing of the kind, I must be convinced I am a white disc just like them, right? So there's already this fear of being, of the possibility of wearing a black disc, because I see 2 white discs in front of me and they are hesitant. Because if they saw that I was black, they would have immediately assumed based upon looking at, so let me slow down. So that we should locate that this person who's making this argument is prisoner A, and that he's looking at prisoners B and C. And so because B and C do nothing of the first nature, then he must presuppose that he is a white disc, right? And then because they do not, in fact, move upon a second glance, then okay, I must conclude that I am white just like them, right? So he gives 2 reasons why he is not a black disc, even though there's the possibility he might. right? Because the possibility is that he sees two white discs in front of him, but because of their suspended motion, then he must infer that he is not, right?
Also,
And
there's
so,
something in here like the fact that there's only the possibility of two black discs makes this verification something that could be logically deduced as such, right?
yeah,
There's three whites, there's only two blacks. Had he been a black and they saw that, that would have changed their action. Am I
exactly,
right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Or at least there's one black that was visible. It would also change that. But the fact that he sees, and this is prisoner A, and the also interesting dilemma is that every one of them is taking the position of prisoner A, right?
Right.
That's another thing. They're all making the same argument in their own head. And this is why they leave to the door at the same time to make their conclusion.
What's funny also is that they are all whites. He's not wrong.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But the way that he arrives at that conclusion is still fallacious.
Yeah, it's then that's why it's a perfect sophism, right? Right. And
Because
as
he
he
is a
says,
white.
yeah, yeah. Because as we know it from a bird's eye view, the black discs aren't present, right?
Correct.
But
He
that's
is
the
a
whole.
white, but this is not how he knows it, in fact.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
He knows it in a way that he's convinced himself, and it has to deal with this field of verification from the other, right? Not that they speak to one another, but the suspended motion.
Right. Right.
And
The
as he
suspended
says when
motion.
he in the next page on 163, he says, every sophism initially presents itself as a logical error, and a first objection to this sophism can be easily formulated. Let us call A the real subject who concludes himself, and B and C those reflected subjects upon whose conduct A founds his deduction. So I already said that pretty much like the only way he could find his deduction and his lines of argumentation is from B and C, right? And he says one might object that since B's conviction is based on C's expectation, the strength of his conviction must logically dissipate when C stops hesitating, right? So that's another element too, right? So like A grounds his reasoning on B and C, but then B and C have their own dilemma as well, right?
Right. Right. Which also strikes me that there's something of a triangulation here too.
Mm-hmm.
The three factor,
Mm-hmm.
is being brought forward. And on the same page that you're on, Andrew, I underlined this concluding sentence where he said, "It is the fact that neither of them left first, which allows each to believe he is a white, and their hesitating for but one instant would clearly suffice to reconvince each of them beyond the
Mm-hmm.
shadow of a doubt that he is a white."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And for hesitation is logically excluded for whomever sees two blacks. But it is also excluded in reality in this first step of the deduction four, since no one finds himself in the presence of a black and a white, there is no way for anyone to leave on the basis of what can be deduced therefrom.
And yet they all make their way to the exit.
Exactly.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
very amusing logical problem.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we could go on and on and on about like like this like problematic, but I think the important thing, which we've kind of built up to like in like the past like 30 minutes up until now, is that we get from this formulation two suspensive scansions, as he calls it. He says the test exposes the process of verification in the very act, and then each of the subjects manifest form of conclusion, right? And so the suspended motions and process are important for, I think, what like Nick has been saying about like this property of like time, not just in its logical aspect, but also like in the Kantian sense, the subjective aspect as well that we see in Lacan, that there's a subjective motion or suspension of motion. And he says like, um, right here, I think I have it underlined. In fact, they take on this role only after the conclusion of this logical process, since the act they suspend evinces this very conclusion. One thus cannot object on the basis that they bring into the solution an element external to the logical process itself. But nonetheless, like this process is still carried out. And so these two suspended motions, he says there's three combinations of subjects, characteristically, characteristic attributes are only logically possible. So with this first suspended motion, right, we have a 3 combination: 2 blacks, 1 white, 1 black, 2 whites, or 3 whites, right? These are the only possible combinations from the deduction, right? Once
Mm-hmm.
this first combination is ruled out by what all 3 subjects see, the question as to which of the other 2 is the case will still remain open. And its answer can only be derived from the second aspect of this suspended motion, experiential data provided by the suspended motion, which amounts to signals by which the subjects communicate to each other in a mode determined by the conditions of the test, what they are forbidden to exchange in an intentional mode, namely what the other sees in these attributes. And this kind of just like, I think is just a complicated way of saying like how we get to um, the way that time manifold, like the time manifold is not just sort of arrow of time continuity, right? But rather disruptions and discontinuity because of these
Mm.
combinations in which we get the moment of the glance, the moment of comprehension, and the moment of conclusion. But it's never in this sort of like A, B, C, D, F, G linear time, but always happen in different configurations of like, okay, are there what did I read? Are there 2 blacks, 1 white? Are there 1 black, 2 whites? Or are there all 3 right? 3 whites. These right here will determine how the 3 moments of time modulate.
I think it's also worth mentioning, zooming out a little bit here, that this is 1945, and like in French thought, like French phenomenology has already been very interested in time.
Mm.
So Lacan, he's already read Minkowski. Minkowski wrote Lived Time, which is like psychiatry and time, and he's a
He's a Bergson.
Bergsonian,
Don't forget
right?
Heidegger being in
Heidegger,
time,
yeah,
which time is a
exactly.
horizon for
Bergson on
possibility.
duration, yeah, like what you're saying,
Yeah,
Heidegger, horizon.
that's what came to mind for me too. I was thinking how it's like I haven't read Bergson, but I know that he wants to introduce a notion of time that's opposed to clock time, that's opposed to measurable time, which I would take to be more experiential. And it's like I feel like Lacan here is cutting a middle path between a commonplace notion of time as measurable and segmented and as an analog to space, and then a time that would be more so romantic, for lack of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
a time
Mm-hmm.
of feeling and a time of experience. And he's saying, well, actually, let's take the logician's lens here and understand how time is ultimately constituted by judgments, which are themselves acts. They aren't judgments that we make on the basis of clear evidence as purely scientific detached subjects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
no, that's a good point too. And also the distinction between like the Heideggerian notion of time and its relation to Dasein isn't like just the horizon of one's possibility and authenticity, but like he distinguishes it from like inauthentic time, which I mean, it's been forever since I've grappled with being in time. But from my conversation with our good friend Colin Bodale, like for Heidegger, inauthentic time, one of its aspects would be vulgar clock time, but I think also like to have time as like a category itself, even in like the, I don't know, the Aristotelian or even Hegelian lens would be inauthentic time. Whereas like for Heidegger, authentic time not only relates to like one's possibilities, right? And being towards, but also that it can be sort of repeated from the past, right? And so this is where we get into his like all these like fascistic qualities that kind of
Mm.
elude Heidegger's notion of time, like going like looking about like this romantic way of history and how we could repeat it. That would be a part of Dasein's authenticity. But I think this is a unique way of thinking about time because of like, as you were saying, Nick, with the judgments, it's not like this passive way of contemplating and making a right idea or coming from a right perspective, but that there's always already an apting with judgment, right?
Yeah, and
That
I think it's so interesting that we have the moment of the glance because it's signifying. So the signifier is there right from the start in a way, but it isn't a signifier with a positive referent because it doesn't tell us anything immediately about the exact color of the disc that one bears. But it does introduce something probabilistic into it. But the important thing is that it signifies nothing, right? The signifier signifies nothing in a sense, but it sets in motion a process. That's what's so fascinating, right? The signifier as such signifies nothing, as Lacan says, but it's all the more active for that reason, right? It actually propels you forward. It precipitates something, a process which later will be resolved through the explanation of the sophism, but we begin with a negative one, right? We begin with a minus one.
right, yeah, and especially like how the minus one like is characterized by the missing book in the library shelf, right? There's like a space holder for it, but it's missing. And so like I think, yeah, that's a good way to kind of compare it with the movement of the signifier because it's this missing signifier. So there's already a representative, a signifier for that, which, the subject that is missing is the missing signifier minus one. But that like this representative quasi signifier, which has no referent, is addressing and verifying itself as representative in the field of knowledge, which is the other, right? Because the other isn't just some person, right? The other big O is the field of signifiers, right? Which create like a battery bank, the locus of speech, the field of language, but then also how that determines the subject's relationship to certainty and knowledge, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to leap too far ahead here, but if we do go back to the end and, Andrew, when you brought up the classic Aristotelian syllogism, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal. I think I'm getting it out of
Oh yeah, all men
sequence
are
there.
mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore
Socrates is a
Socrates
man,
is mortal.
Socrates is mortal. And he says here, I will nevertheless show what such a logic would have to furnish, faced with the inadequacy one senses in an assertion such as I am man, couched in whatever form of classical logic, and derived as the conclusion from whatever premises one likes. For example, man is a rational animal, which is the famous adage of Aristotle. This assertion assuredly appears closer to its true value when presented as the conclusion of the form here demonstrated of anticipating subjective assertion. 1, a man knows what is not a man. 2, men recognize themselves among themselves as men. 3, I declare myself to be a man for fear of being convinced by men that I am not a man. So it's like we have a fully constituted field of knowledge here and a field of the other in which prisoner A, B, and C are inserted, but it doesn't disclose anything positive about the existence of the other as such. Just the possibility of not being included.
Right. I mean, and that's the whole point about like the signifier, right? For Lacan is that it never gives anybody an answer or meaning about life or death, right? So like life and death are just signifiers as such, but they never give us any sort of meaning, right? To what these signifiers purely represent
Yeah,
for man. Only they're just riddles.
and I don't want to do too much wild psychoanalysis here, but just to take it back to phenomenology, it's like being towards death is Dasein, right? I mean, for Heidegger, and well, what does that mean? Is that the cessation of life, or is there another kind of death, which we're between, right? We're between two deaths. The death that the signifier marks us with, like we're marked to die in a sense by the signifier, but that doesn't merely mean that one day we will perish and cease to experience anything. You know, you're already a corpse in a sense, without getting too morbid, as soon as you make any assertion about yourself.
That reminds me of the fact that in Sanskrit, the word kala means time, right? And kala also means black, in the sense it's a signifier for conditionality, for mortality, for death, basically. In other words, time equals death. To be born, to be mortal, is kala. And to be bound in a signifying chain, which is temporal, and spatial, is to suffer, basically. This is like an Eastern idea. I think you're getting at something like that. I think Lacan also is getting at something like that, even in showing us that despite the having of logic, we still don't arrive at a certainty. Right? So what is the function of logic then? What is rationality? Like, where is this really taking us in this overall sliding of a signifying chain? Are we just sliding along, suspended movements and arriving at what we think are moments of understanding, only to discover that we're just sliding in a signifying chain anyway?
Right. And it's kind of funny because for anyone who's ever taught, if you have a classroom of students, and I teach children, so I see the instant of the glance all the time whenever I ask for a show of hands about something, or we play a game where they have to identify whether an Italian expression matches the image that they see on the screen, and just thumbs up or thumbs down. And you see the anticipated certainty immediately, and then the hesitation, because either someone might actually instantly know the answer, give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and then you see everybody in the classroom change their answer in the moment based on what the general consensus is. That's kind of a crude example of what's much more, in a complex way elaborated here. But, there is something experiential and immediately evident in the behavior of crowds, for example.
Yeah, and this isn't to get into because then you get crowd psychology of just the masses.
Yeah, crowd's not the right word exactly,
yeah,
but group dynamics, let's say, yeah.
Yeah, group dynamics is better, but this kind of is very nuanced to the mob mentality or the herd, people are dumb and that's why they need to be I don't know, controlled or something. This weird rhetoric. But it shows that there's an embedded anxiety as well as an anticipation of certainty that goes on in a collective modality. And I think this theme carries on in Lacan. And your example just made me think of one of our favorite passages, or mine specifically, in Seminar 3, when he's talking about the discourse of freedom, right? It's what is freedom actually, but everything that is, but its obstacle towards any freedom, right? Freedom of the market, freedom of property, freedom of expression, or whatever. Yeah, these are particular things, but they don't express something that would indicate discourse of freedom as such. And what we have is just the myth of the individual, right? An individual's myth. And so this dilemma of the discourse of freedom, which is actually a shared delusion, manifests an anxiety in oneself when somebody comes up to them and asks for some advice, or whether or not they as a person ought to get married, right? Do you think I'm the person that ought to get married one day? And the person who it's addressed to isn't going to secretly say no, or say no while holding some type of ulterior motive, or think less of them, I don't think you should get married because I think you're a terrible person. But no, rather it provokes an anxiety because you're put in the position of judgment, that this is what it means to be this person and the discourse of freedom, and what it means to be somebody who's ready for marriage, right? Being placed in as a subject supposed to know, ultimately,
Mm.
that brings a lot of anxiety because of encountering the groundless ground of that discourse itself, right? Of freedom. You're really resorting to like an imaginary myth of individuality that
Mm.
falls directly onto itself when confronted with
Yeah,
this like verification.
because the seeker of advice immediately authorizes the would-be
Mm.
advisor
Mhm.
as their master in that moment.
Mhm.
And there seems to be more anxiety that comes with being authorized as the master or the subject supposed to know than being in the subordinate position, even though we all strive to find recognition, and finding recognition would always be obtaining the license of the master in some sense. Because the master is imagined to be free. The slave is, by definition, bound.
Bound. Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me, but maybe the guy giving advice needs to posture like this when he talks.
See, now I believe you all the more because you're doing the triangle, right? This is the
The man, the manosphere
triangulation.
triangle. See, the problem with modern men these days.
Yeah, but it doesn't look. It's if you do it like this, it's not as forceful. You have to.
Yeah, so you
The
gotta
camera
have
doesn't
a kind
really
of like,
allow.
but your bottom finger's gotta be kind of loose, and these ones gotta be firm, you know.
Oh, okay. I don't see. I don't know. I haven't been trained.
It's too funny. But I would, that's like, it's almost like, it's like to put it into like cultural terms. This is exactly like, we could see this with the influencer, like they're trying to verify themselves as having this like knowledge of what it means to be a successful person, right? But it only amounts to like this imaginarized myth, right? Of success, even if they don't use the term freedom. It's the myth of the individual, right? What does Lacan say in that essay, The Neurotics, individual
Mhm.
myth, right? Um, that this myth is but just like a play, and I'm quoting Seminar 4. The neurotic is an actor, and he acts with an alter ego, performing for a spectator, and the spectator is the big other, right? He's
Mhm.
performing for the big other, whether he realizes it or not.
Right, you can't be an influencer with you can't receive verification of your influence without the other saying that, they like what you've done or whatever, which is then interpreted as verification that,
Right.
I'm influential, right?
What do you? Yeah, it's like, what do you think, chat?
Yeah.
Chat is the manifestation of the other as the collective of the hundreds of thousands of little others, which somehow constitute this discourse, which is ultimately what authorizes you as the master. But the double bind that, like, an influencer would be placed in is being the arbiter of the law while also being subject to it. And I think anybody who takes the position of like, well, I've arrived at this place of success. Let me tell you how I got there, right? That's
Mm.
like the influencer grift 101 of selling a course to somebody. And you can
Mhm.
uh, get to where I am. You can obtain this position one day if you just do A, B, and C. But the, the anxiety that comes from that, and the irony is that, like, how could you actually verify that you embody, with an emphasis on body there, the law that you uphold? Because that would require there's an outside agency outside of yourself, which would, in a way, you know, diminish you as the master. Like, so it's endless, infinite regress of displacing the agency while trying to own it.
Right, it's like what Andrew pointed out earlier too, which is there can be a form of self-authorization that's thoroughly narcissistic. In other words, the infant controlling his own image in the mirror experiences authorization of himself as something that has motor coordination, right? Despite the
Right.
fact that that remains nothing more than an anticipatory moment.
Right, the jubilation of the
It's
Yeah.
insane.
symbols, right? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And that's a funny thing too, because he talks about in this essay, like, in one of the, combinations of, like, the suspended motions, like, the verification of his semblables, right? So, like,
Mhm.
the image of the two people that, like, mastering their movements, if I understand correctly, is also, an instance of verification of who he is as a subject.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
And I'm
interesting that
gonna
word. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Nishi.
I was gonna read this passage on 170 that relates to this. Lacan, it's the middle of the page. Lacan says, "The I, subject of the conclusive assertion, is isolated from the other, that is, from the relation of reciprocity, by a logical beat. This movement of the logical genesis of the I, through a decanting of its own logical time, largely parallels its psychological birth. Just as, let us recall, the psychological I emerges from an indeterminate specular transitivism, assisted by an awakened jealous tendency, the I in question here defines itself through a subjectification of competition with the other in the function of logical time. As such, it seems to me to provide the essential logical form rather than the so-called existential form of the psychological I." I think it's a huge statement.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah,
and that's
absolutely.
that's very important, because this whole dialectic of jealousy comes from the verification of the other and this moment of transitivism. Because the transitivism is like, I establish that there is an I, which is me, and that there is a you, but the demarcation, and I'm getting this from this was really explained well by me, or well to me by a really cool Lacanian, who's part of the Compass, Shamu Seth. Really great. He did a really great course on the Wolfman. But when he talks about this like moment of transitivism, there is an I and there is a you, but the demarcations between the I and the you are so blurred. I do not know the difference between what constitutes as your body or as your property versus my own. So, in a
Mhm.
sense, when I hit you, I say, ow, you hit me, because the lines of the two bodies are not fully divided to say, this belongs to you and this belongs to me. I can only say I and you without giving attributions, right? Dare I say there's an existence of the I and the you, but not a differentiation of what constitutes that and its attribution. So in a sense, this competition and this jealousy manifests itself because if I verify all my certainties or all my knowledge on the other, and there is a inconsistency to those verifications from the semblable of the other, then that causes a problem for me as a subject, right?
Right. And do you remember a few discussions earlier? We were all talking about pronouns and the pronomial
Mhm.
and how difficult it is for the child to, like you were saying, overcome the sort of transitivism that allows for a, we could almost call it like a domestication of the I. And I find that as an adult, it doesn't it doesn't always become that much easier, you know. To use a real another kind of crude example, it's like I find that when describing any situation syntactically that involves many different pronouns, that it can really trip you up. You know, it can trip you up to like coordinate all of the different I's and hims and hers and, well, theys, you know, to take it to that level. Um, I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but yeah, it's not so simple, and it always involves, I think, something like a kind of repressed syllogistic
Mm.
logic.
That reminds me also of what we were talking about earlier. I think maybe Andrew read it, where Lacan was saying that, these prisoners can't talk to each other. They can't communicate, but their only mode of communication is a kind of signaling, right? And in Seminar 10, Lacan's very clear, anxiety is a signal, right? Also, anxiety is
Right.
the affect of the subject, is his formula in there. And I think that's also here, because he talks about, anxiety on 169 a little bit when he mentions the ontological form of anxiety curiously reflected in the grammatically equivalent expression for fear that the lagging behind might engender error seems to emerge. So anxiety is like so critical here.
Right. Well, and so I remember when I read the two suspensions, the first motion of suspension gives us three possible combinations. And that ontological anxiety can only manifest in this third combination, which are all three whites. I hasten to declare myself a white so that these whites who I consider in this way do not precede me in recognizing themselves for what they are. Right. I think that is interesting because that's what brings forth this uh signal, which is linked to the anxiety, which is almost not like metaphysical but ontological insofar as this logic creates this structure where anxiety is contingent to that.
Well,
Yeah.
he says in Seminar 2 how the I is always destructible, but me, is not. There's like a certain permanence to moi, but the I is endlessly destructible. It is always under threat of erasure in a sense. And think of how many decisions we make throughout a day that are somehow precipitated by these different moments of signaling that we don't even register, which just goes to show you that none of us really can justify the claims to where we are in life in some way, because you can't truly reconstruct this process of the forms of signaling that ultimately inform uh, where you've ended up. Analysis, I think, is an attempt. One might approach analysis as an attempt to do that, to integrate every episode of one's life in these important monumental moments that constitute something like the body of one's existence, their place in society, only to find that the attempt to narrativize fails.
Right.
And the analyst can't be the person that arranges these things for you. They can't say like, well, this happened and then this happened. That's what a kind of crude understanding of psychoanalysis sees analysis as, like, oh, so you're going to tell me what the true story of my being is, because and I don't.
Right. Well, I mean, this kind of goes hand in hand with what he says in this third combination, where he talks about I haste to declare myself as white, because what he says, and I think you had read the Eclipse uh earlier, Nishi. He says that the
Yeah,
eclipse,
that was good.
there's an eclipse of objective time, or like the time for comprehension is superseded by this need to conclude that I am white, because if the others have the possibility to conclude that I am black, well, I want to beat them to the punchline, right? So in fear of not being a white disc, I declare myself white before the other tries to authorize myself for me, right? And there's the double bind in that, right? So because he's trying to play off the semblables that he sees in front of him, but at the same time, he's trying to declare himself white before they try to put him in a moment of understanding based upon them declaring the opposite, right? So he has to risk comprehending to be. It's almost like the perfect neurotic thing of like, I'm either thinking or I am not, or I am, but I'm not thinking, right? I think that's kind of like what
Right.
he's building up.
Yeah.
And also the haste to distinguish oneself from others as an I subject. I know that I am what I am, and I'm going to get there before you define me for myself, even though I'm defining myself in relation to you as assemblable.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Exactly. So there's still a form of verification from the other, right?
Yes. And maybe this also, going back to what Nick was saying, points out that psychoanalysis is concerned with the fact that there is an unconscious logic that has structured the series of events in our life, that maybe we don't even realize how we've gotten to where we've gotten to, per se. And maybe it's not even so much about understanding a story or archetypes, all these things. It's a matter of seeing that there has been a logic, but that logic also is a fallacy.
Well, it's also like with the neurotic that's always in
Yeah.
his head, where he's in a haste to make an interpretation about himself before the analyst does, right?
Right. Great example. It's so true, though.
Thus, he puts the analyst in this sort of imaginary other of like the master slave dialectic.
That is so true. And I mean, if you're on the couch making these disclosures, it's like you do want to beat the analyst to the punch, where half the time the analyst isn't giving you an interpretation. You know, you want to beat them to the punch to sort of like almost outwit this
Yeah,
person that
and
you've designated as the master.
even the signals that the analyst may give are very much deceptive, right? Because like the or oh, or even just the tell me more doesn't necessarily mean that there's analytic fruit hanging right there, but it's just to keep you to speak more, only for you to fall victim in your own haste, because you assume by those signals that you're leading
Yeah.
to the path towards knowledge and certainty, and therefore you want to beat the analyst to the punchline.
I love this idea of haste.
This also reminds me of something I brought up earlier, maybe when we were doing function and field, Andrew, which was that in analytic technique, which Lacan spends time elucidating, the fact is that punctuation is something that is also punctual, It's like, it's a timed event. The cut, the scansions of analysis, in a way, all interpretation functions like a scansion, And that is a very much a timed thing, And I think that's also related to why Lacan is spending so much time elaborating time. It's relevant to analysis in a meta sense too, of things all three of us have been talking about, which is, what is the end of analysis? What is the frame in which analysis unfolds temporally, right? And isn't there anxiety in that, right? Like every time you show up for a session, there's some anxiety around this whole thing of like, how long is this going to go on for? And like, can this go on forever? Where do I place myself in relation to the perpetuity that analysis seems to engender for us? In which there's also scansions being made.
Right. Yeah. Analysis, terminable and interminable. And, and that the essay I shared with you guys, Miller talks about the Turing device, which marks a square on a strip of paper, which we could think of in the abstract sense as endless. And it's always marking the square. And he says that every session you attend is the marking of one of these squares, but every session you don't attend also marks one of these squares, and that if you end analysis, the Turing device continues to mark those squares. So the machine is set in motion, and the time of analysis always continues in perpetuity, like you were saying, Nishi, whether you attend or not. Whether you end your analysis, go 5 years without going to a session and then take it up again, or never go back to analysis. It's always happening in some sense.
Right, and to end analysis is like the analysand has to make the cut. They have to, in a way, assert a certainty that, as Andrew said earlier, like this analysis has taken place. Like I verify to myself that I've completed an analysis,
There's a really great episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry wants to cut things off with his therapist because he saw his therapist at the beach in a thong. It's a really great episode because he's like so weirded out by the fact that his therapist was in a thong, and he contrives to end, it's not analysis, but let's call it analysis, with his therapist, and he's like, I'm cured. And his therapist is like, what, really? I don't think so. And, yeah, like I feel great. Everything's fine. He's trying to end analysis, but the pretext is something completely extraneous.
Right.
That's
like
hilarious.
the prisoner's making for the exit.
Yeah, and I think that because you brought up like the self-authorization, I think the self-authorization is definitely something where like there is again responsibility and like I don't want to sound too like hero's journey overcoming your anxiety, but like in a way where you're able to like accept your symptom as your own and move through the fantasy and the anxiety of the signal where there is taking responsibility versus the verification of the other and trying to beat the other to the response. I think that's quite different. And that comes from, the movement of the time of an analysis and to conclude that an analysis was done, right? Not to rival with the analyst by saying, I declare myself a man in fear of not being one, right?
Right.
I don't know what it means to be cured, but in fear of the analyst saying so, I declare myself as cured.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's also
Right.
funny too, like, as and analysts don't say this in their, you know, interpretation with their patients. They don't use terminology. Like, I know we all know this, but like, for any of the people listening that have never gone into analysis and are curious about it and only know analytic theory, like your analyst is not going to say, oh, this is a moment where you were castrated, or this is like, this is like what you're describing as an Oedipal moment. They're not going to use that terminology, right? But in a sense, like when you get these like apprehensive patients that come in with ambivalence, they love and hate the analyst. There's these moments where they'll try to one up the analyst by like saying like, before you think I'm expressing an Oedipal moment when I talk about my mother, like let me show you, pal. Like these are the moments where it's like, okay, well, I wasn't implying that, but please, like, let's hear about this. Say more, son. Say more.
Yeah, I was listening to a Zizek lecture where he was talking about how, I don't know who he was talking about, but an analyst like switching it up on their patient who came to analysis being like, yeah, well, I want to kill my father and have sex with my mother. And the analyst was like, what are you talking about? That's disgusting. To try to like switch it up on them. Like, what? Like, because they're trying to one up the analyst, and it's kind of like playing dumb in that way is like a way, because it's like the idea of coming to analysis with all of these assumptions, and your view of it is very much colored by either the work you've done reading psychoanalytic theory or just basic popular notions of what analysis is, and something that Freud didn't have to handle in his day so much until like later in his career when he was more established.
Yeah, and I will say, like, from my own experience, that like, because I grappled with like this notion of like when you go through an analysis for so long, there's going to be a point in time where you don't need the analyst because you're already interpreting yourself. And I think in a sense I deceived myself by trying to make an interpretation before my previous analyst at the time would do, and it ended up becoming this sort of imaginary rivalry, even though there was nothing aggressive about it, even though I wasn't like apprehensive, there was a bit of that anxious residue towards it because I was trying to attach myself to a field of knowledge, right? So
Mm.
whether it's like aggressive and extremely rivalry or it's subtle, there's still this signal that relates to the verification of the other, right? And in another sense, like, this kind of was dispelled with my new analyst when I was describing something that I may have talked about in previous analysis, in regarding my relationship. And my analyst doesn't give an interpretation. He just goes, wow, wow, you want that? Why do you want that? That's crazy. So I'm just like, wait, what? But it had an effect because
Yeah.
not only did it suspend my need for certainty, but even suspend, about myself, but even suspend my certainty regarding how an analytic intervention ought to be, right?
Mm.
That this is
Right.
what makes the analyst like at a point of not a savant, but like with savoir faire, right?
Mm.
To know how to respond. In a sense, that joke that you gave, like Nick, where he's like, "What? That's disgusting." Like, Why would you do that? Like, maybe he doesn't really think that or not, but like the point is that it had an effect because like it made the analyzand stumble back a bit, like, what the fuck just happened? Like, I was
Yeah.
expecting something, I had these preconceived notions. I'm trying to one up the analyst, and rather than them responding in a way that I would imagine, they do the exact opposite or something totally different.
Right, and I think maybe this is also something I've conceptualized to myself, at least, as the shift from like a competitive dynamic in analysis to a collaborative dynamic in analysis, which I think is an appropriate like stage for analysis to reach, where the analyst isn't so much in the position of a subject supposed to know, giving you knowledge. They're helping you analyze yourself. They kind of turn it back onto you. They bring out the inquiry in what it is that you've said, and they ask you why you've said that, what is that exactly? And it drives you to free associate more, to discover in that situation, you know, what it is that you just said and why it is you just said that and why you're even talking about this at all in analysis. And it becomes like an analysis of analysis, like a kind of it becomes self-aware in the most positive sense, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so like this, even though this is like Lacan of like the 1940s, like when we get to like Lacan of the 70s, like specifically, what is it? Seminar 19 Alpha, Talking to Brick Walls. He talks about this conception from Nicholas Acusa, a famous medieval theologian and natural scientist. He has this text called Learned Ignorance, and we have to cultivate ourselves to become what he says in Latin, docta ignorantia, the doctor of ignorance. Because like we everything that we try to do to know about God, we end up not knowing about God. God is sort of unknown, and we could only experience it in this apophatic way, which kind of goes back to like the mystic Pseudo Dionysius, the Areophagite. It's like a negative knowledge. And so for him to know God is to also unlearn. Kind of sounds very Eastern as well. So like to know is unknown. And what I think Lacan is doing to kind of invert that in a more secular and analytical way is that to have knowledge of the unconscious, or what would be called unconscious knowledge, is to also become a learned ignorant person,
Mm.
which he advocates for the analyst as well. But for the analysand, let's say, learned ignorance would be to let go of the verification of the other, right? So to reflect upon ourselves, to be in a moment of comprehension, isn't acquisition of positive knowledge, but knowledge in the real, right?
Mm.
Going beyond just the unconscious as a discourse of the other, but rather of like the real, the waste product, the objet the surplus. That's to be unknown. By knowing, we unknow ourselves, and we also let go of enjoying, because the unconscious no longer becomes in that aspect of Lacan, but I think in that aspect, when you become deep in an analysis, no longer becomes the it that thinks, but the it that speaks. The it that speaks and enjoys and wants to know nothing about it.
Mm.
That's the formula of the unconscious in Lacan of Seminar 19 and 20. It's a subversion of the Cartesian cogito, no longer that it thinks somewhere else, like in Freud's conception of the unconscious, but that it speaks. And when it speaks, it enjoys nonetheless, whether it wants to know about its enjoyment or not.
Right. So jouissance is not dependent on the subjective assertion of certainty or of knowledge as an object that's been attained.
Exactly. And there is a relationship to jouissance and knowledge, but it's only insofar as when we alienate our knowledge or enjoyment as the other's enjoyment, qua the master's discourse, that we're caught in this like production of knowledge that never really gets us anywhere. We just create surplus, right? We create suffering. We continuously alienate ourselves. We do this in love all the time. And then we go into a university discourse by trying to find the 5 languages of love. If I know how to do this, that, and the third to my woman or to my man, then like, I'll know how to love, right? There's so many Substacks, there's so many freaking articles everywhere on how to love properly or how to add more intimacy in your life, but that's still alienating your own knowledge into the field of the other, right? But
Right, because
while
there
remaining,
is
I was going to say, while remaining ignorant
yeah,
of what you enjoy.
yeah, because I mean, I think essential to this social performance of individuality, which at least now is the like overriding imperative of our society, um, in late stage capitalism, if you want to call it that. There, yeah, it's like we equate desire and love in a very dangerous way. In that, if we understand our desire and are able to perform it, then we will be worthy of love in the way you're supposed to. But I mean, one of the major insights of Lacan's teaching is that love and desire are very much at variance. So
Mm.
there is no ultimate appropriation of one's desire in a way that would ever be socially acceptable, let's say, and ultimately earn the subject the love from the other that they're seeking.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this takes me back to the situation of dilemma itself as a double bind. And if we think of the prisoner A, for example, it's like, what exactly is this prisoner supposed to do in the situation? There's no way to win, is what I'm seeing. It's like there's no way to arrive at a way out of the game where anyone is a winner. They're all caught. There's
Yes,
no solution that can produce victory. Am I right about
'cause-
that?
yeah, because every prisoner is prisoner A.
Right?
There is no B and C, and there is no prisoner A. It's like everyone is the subject trying to attain subjecthood, to coin a phrase.
Right. So
Right,
their
right.
desire for certainty is already alienated.
Is it a desire or such, or is it more an anticipation?
Maybe it's more in anticipation.
Hmm. And though the
And
element
one,
of
yeah,
desire is really explicit in there, I wonder, like, when we put that into, like, when we put this formula into an analytic context, like, what desire allows us to do, right? What desire allows us to do is to give up what we don't have, right? To the other that doesn't want it. That is, of course, love, but it's like to desire is to also lack. And when you accept your lack and accept that you lack something that you want from the other, then you could start to inquire about that. But when there isn't desire, there's no analysis. There's just pure demand, right?
Mm.
And like this is like what's so interesting. Like Lacan could be cryptic, but I think at sometimes he's just kind of quite simple. There's something about desire. It's like, yeah, desire is lack. But when we embrace lack, not in this like poetics of lack, but like when we just accept that we don't have something and we're never going to get it, but we want something, it's like we could speak about it more in analysis and like why we're so troubled. When we learn to differentiate between what we reduce to demand and what it is that we lack, now we're getting at somewhere. At least I think that's how I'm kind of understanding it from my own analysis and also speaking with other analysts and situating this stuff into real context.
Mm-hmm. And similarly, like the prisoner doesn't know what he has, right?
Hmm.
He has a disc, but he doesn't know what the disc is that he has, right?
Yeah.
And so there is this anxiety around knowledge, around certainty. Maybe it's not yet a desire, but I think you're very right to point out, the trajectory of desire as something that acknowledges that lack, even experiences jouissance in relationship to it, because that is how the analyst arrives at the position of the objet A, you know?
Yeah.
That is how they function as the desire of the analyst.
Yeah. And also, like, when we talk about transference and love, it's like we also get this fact because, like, a common misconception when we read early Lacan is to think that all he cared about was intersubjectivity, but he's constantly showing that there is an asymmetry to what philosophers and even people of his contemporary time think of when they think of intersubjectivity. They think that it's reciprocation, that I see a mutual existing subject in front of me that also gives me verification about myself. This is what we see in like phenomenology, especially when we talk about the other and Altarian recognition, that I see a mutually existing subject, right? But actually, no, there's something unknown about that subject. What do they want from me? But also, how do I see them not as an existing subject, but in terms of love as something that I want from them or something that's provoking me and reducing me to an object? And like he gets at this perfectly in Seminar 8. And Lacan makes a lot of cool myths, but I think this is probably like the most banger of a myth that he constructs. And I think this like goes hand in hand with like not only logical time, but when we apply like the verification of the other in love. He says, to illustrate it for you, I will take the liberty of completing an image, truly making it into a myth. There is a hand that extends towards the fruit or the rose or the log that suddenly bursts into flames. Its gesture of reaching, drawing close, and stirring up is closely related to the ripening of the fruit, the beauty of the flower, or the blazing of the log. If in the movement of reaching, of drawing, of stirring, the hand goes far enough towards the object that another hand comes out of the fruit or out of the flower or out of the log and extends toward your hand. And at that moment, your hand freezes in the closed plenitude of the fruit, in the open plenitude of the flower, or in the explosion of a log which bursts into flames. Then what is produced is love. But we must not stop there. We must say that what we are looking at here is love. In other words, that it's your love when you were first the beloved object, and suddenly you become he who desires. If that's not fire, like, I don't know what the fuck is, because what he's trying to say is like when you try to love, or even when you try to verify something, when you try to inquire in something about the field of the other, actually your own alienation pops out and reaches out to you as you reach out to it. And there's that sudden freeze right there. But how are you loving? Are you trying to reach for a fruit, a flower, or a log that explodes into flames, you know?
I love that. I love that. I think that's great. I had not heard that one before, actually. And but I think also you brought up a very key point around intersubjectivity. That logical time is a commentary on that. It is a critique as well of existing notions around intersubjectivity. And I think again for Lacan, the intersubjective is just full of imaginary conceptions. It's an imaginary structure, right? Which is the nature of the double bind, right? The fact that there is doubling to begin with. And so yeah, I think it's very original, in fact.
Yeah, and you, again, to repeat what we've been saying, it's like even though there's you as prisoner A, and then there's B and C, that everybody is actually prisoner A, right? And they are confronted with somebody who's supposed to play the position as B and C, but it's only not to verify themselves as subjects, but to verify yourself as a subject, right? It's your own
Right, and
hand reaching back out to you.
what's trippy also to me is that even though Lacan seems to slow down time to show us like the instant of the glance, like the time of comprehending and all these, he kind of really, the lag. At the same time, he's saying there's this simultaneity happening, you know? They each kind of arrive at the same thing in the same moment. They all make for the exit, And as you're saying, they're all prisoner A.
Right. And when you look at the three combinations, right, when there's two what is it? Let me read it. So we already know that combination three, where there's all whites, that we have this rush to conclude and there's no time for comprehension, lest I get excluded out. Um, we have in the first being opposite of two blacks and only one white, um, we have right here a logic and a logical exclusion. And with that, we have this moment that provides the temporal movement of like hesitation, right? We have the glance and then we have the hesitation. But then what's interesting about movement two, where I am black, the two whites that I see would waste no time realizing that they are whites. We have the glance that gets condensed into comprehension, right? And I think with these two movements, what we get is like I'm trying to tie it in what you're saying. What we get is like the way that comprehension and the signal that could be, I guess, the glance could be, I guess, the signal kind of interplay and create two different dimensions of time that are not, again, a perfect procession. There are ways in which, like, each positioning of the others causes interruptions, right? And not only in the logical progression of it, because there is a logic that's happening, but the subjective apprehension of it. Because the logical time is supposed to allow myself to conclude I am the subject, right? But we already have a subject trying to conceive itself in subjecthood within this process of logical time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Parletra. If you enjoyed this conversation, consider subscribing to our Substack at parletrapress.com or follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Parletra Podcast to stay tuned for our next episode.